All right, Adam Creighton, journalist extraordinaire. Thanks for coming on Based podcast. Based, by the way, is for those who are incredibly based, and I think your performance during COVID, gives you that achievement unlocked. So, congratulations! What an achievement! But I want to just introduce you for those who follow the podcast who don't know. You've been the economics correspondent at the Australian since I think 2012, having previously worked for the Economist. And with a sort of a background in arts, commerce, a Bachelor of Commerce, History and Economics, and you worked at the RBA, I think, and APRA. APRA, right. And then you're a senior advisor to Tony Abbot for a little while as well. So it's a pretty broad and diverse career, but you're well placed to understand all facets of public life. Have I missed anything? What have I missed?
You have missed 6 years on the checkout at Woolworths. That's probably the most formative of all the jobs that I had. My first job.
Yeah, we all remember.
It was 6 years exactly.
They are formative years. You see the best and worst of humanity in those jobs. So I totally get Absolutely. It. I used to have similar sorts of things. I used to sell office furniture once at uni, and I saw all sorts. Interesting people in different formats. So it's very true. Yeah, I think when I think of you and your the recent career, the thing I think most of and the most qualified for Based is your work during COVID. It really stood out like a beacon. One of my complaints along the way was that there just weren't journalists questioning the narrative. And that does not apply to you. You were one of the first out of the blocks, I think, questioning at first the lockdown response and the amount, and using your background in finance and economics and commerce to sort of unpick the concept of lockdowns. What was the moment for you that made you think, hang on, something's not right here?
So this is going back 4 years ago. In fact, it was 4 years ago, I think, this week, right, where the world kind of ended all of these crazy lockdowns. So this is timely, I guess, to do the podcast now. But, kind of early in 2020, I was very scared about the virus too. I remember talking to some senior people. I think I spoke to Peter Costello about it at one point, and, he was worried. I was worried. I was thinking the world was going to collapse. And then, and then more and more data came through February and March and April. And it became increasingly clear to me that this was not the Black Plague. It was a new virus. It was highly contagious, but it was really not particularly lethal. And there are a number of studies that came out in the US, in California, and in the UK that basically showed that straight away. And indeed, the chief health officer of the UK, Chris Whitty, I think his name was, he said on about the 15th of March in a press conference, because they'd obviously been going over all the data, he stood up and said, look, this is not a dangerous virus. Sadly, about 7 days later, the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, made a terrible, terrible decision, and he basically, he plunged the UK into the insanity of lockdown. And, of course, the US followed soon after that, and, the rest is history. So, I guess I just didn't fall for the mass hysteria, and I think, I don't know why that is, because there was only a small group of people that did not. And I think if we get away from that period, I think it will be seen as a period of mass hysteria, like tulip mania, like witch burning, because there's no rational way to explain it. No. Some people now like to look back and say, oh, but we didn't know. Well, actually, no. Yes, we did. We did know. We did know that it was not lethal, and we did know that by shutting down schools and by trying to shut down all of society, not for a week, not for 15 days, but for months and months on end, as it turned out, would be highly destructive, completely insane. On an economic, social, and philosophical level, right? All that was known. And indeed, that's why not a single pandemic plan in any Western country recommended to do what we did. They all said, for a virus like that, which is not particularly lethal and which is very contagious, the best thing is to stay calm and to, just basically give people information, not to, force them to stay home. And then, of course, the whole vaccine, the whole vaccine debacle as well. That's a whole other chapter of insanity. So you have this virus, which is not particularly lethal, and then you literally force everyone to get a vaccine against it. That's actually insane. Kind of now we say it's insane, but that was the conventional wisdom at the time.
And so, you make the point about, there weren't many that followed the actual numbers and the reality of it, but you did. What's your thesis on that? Like, why is it that when you turned on, the evening news, or you opened most newspapers or whatever, or even talk to people on the street, what's your perception of why there weren't more, in particular, journalists that were prepared to go out on a limb like you were, or tell the truth, I suppose.
I mean, I don't want to be too mean to my colleagues, but I think a lot of them, frankly, didn't read much around the virus, and they just watched mainstream media, and they just took that as as gospel. Whatever CNN was saying, effectively, whatever governments were telling mainstream media, which was then just immediately regurgitated by journalists, they just took that as the truth. There's also a great reluctance to stand out. I think in journalism it can be very dangerous, and indeed I got death threats and all sorts of things during that period. It was really unpleasant. My parents were worried about me. I remember having calls with mum and dad about it, and my brother was a high school teacher. He got abused when someone found out that he was my brother. It was really awful. I mean, we forget how dark that March April 2020 period was, and just the sheer insanity that descended on society. And and the most extraordinary thing is, to me even now, and I kind of reflect on it quite often actually, is that you have people thinking that they're living through this extraordinary pandemic, this great historic plague, and yet they don't know anyone who's died from it. Like, they absolutely know no one. So these two ideas are completely disconnected, right? Like, it's insane, actually. And indeed, when I first came to the US in April 21, that was kind of peak insanity still. And the perception from Australia was that, that everyone was dying in the US, and there were bodies everywhere, and the hospitals were filled. And so when I came to Washington, D.C., I made a point of asking Americans, so, how many people do you know who've died from COVID? And basically, no one knew anyone, right? So it was the same here. Like, the actual proportions dying were extremely small, and those who were dying in nursing homes. So they're kind of far removed from mainstream society. So it was just crazy. And indeed, I had emails from News Corp asking me if I was okay. I mean, it's kind of like, and I'm not singling out News Corp. All companies were doing this, right? Yeah. This kind of madness descended on society when this flu, it wasn't even the flu. I mean, I was talking to my brother recently who actually had the flu, and he was, he almost went to hospital, and that was just standard flu. Yeah. But he had COVID twice, and it was nothing. So we just panicked over. I mean, I've had COVID twice, and both times, okay, it's a bit annoying, but it's just like getting a cold.
It's actually quite interesting to break all that down, how it's all panned out. But I'm interested in that. I mean, you really did.
Yeah, sorry I rant about it. Sorry, because as you can see, I'm still angry about it.
Well, you and me both. I mean, I get accused of going on about it too much, but it's one of these things that I don't think we've unpicked. I mean, there are a group of us here in Australia, in Canberra, when we're there pushing for a royal commission, a proper royal commission, not some open and shut inquiry. And of course, there's very little political will at the moment to do that. But how could there not be? I mean, this was, we spent what? $500 billion. We locked down homes. We went off on this therapy frolic that no one had ever done before, and yet we're being told we don't need to look into it anymore. I think it's perfectly understandable that people are still talking about it. Frankly, I think we're not talking about it enough. What's the one of the things that popped out of this, for mine, was the kind of the use of social media and kind of how that played into getting the message out, and what we're now seeing through Western countries with these so-called disinformation laws. The social media space is really, really interesting. You're EXA, as it is now, and do you see that space? I mean, how do you see that interplaying with those traditional mainstream media outlets that do a good job, and commentators like yourself that do a great job? Is it really disruptive? Is it flourishing disinformation, or what's the future, do you think, for social media?
Well, I think the future's bright for social media. I don't know how bright it is for everyone else. I have to be careful what I say, but I mean, I don't think it's a secret that traditional media has been in a bad way for some time. Like as a result of the loss of all those classified advertising revenue and just the sheer amount of competition. There are just so many different sites that you've only got 24 hours a day. Yeah. Like that is fixed. So one person can only consume so much news per day, and now they can consume news all around the world, and not just mainstream outlets, but different individuals on social media. So the competition is huge. I think as long as social media stays free and not tainted by government interference, I think it's a real force for good. The great concern to me is that this kind of period we've had, I mean, you could argue that during COVID that, our government did get involved, and we have evidence, from the Twitter files in the US,
Yeah.
and indeed we know in Australia from Chris Kenny's reporting that the Australian government actually tried to meddle too with people's tweets. So that is very worrying. And when you couple that desire of government to interfere and to censor with new developments in AI, it's a scary future, because it'll be very, very easy to monitor, for AI to monitor posts and conversations in real time, right? And to censor them. So you won't even need humans to read them. So I think that's quite a worrying future. And one of the theses that I've had the back of my mind for a few years now is that tragically, and the broad arc of history is that we are becoming more like China and not the other way around, right? I mean, the thinking was they would become more free like us. Well, it is very, very clear over the last 4 years that is not the case. We are becoming more like them. That is just indisputable. The only question is, will that process stop and slow down? But the misinformation laws that you mentioned, I mean, this is CCP stuff, basically. It's called something different, right? It's giving a government agency the right to determine what is right and wrong. That's basically what it is. Let's face it. That's what it is. And the legislation. I mean, the bill that I read, the Australian bill. I think it's changed. You know more than me, but it was incredibly broadly written. It just shocked me. Wasn't it something like, anyone who does anything to impinge on the health of Australians, or some madness like that, which is basically anything, right? That could be classed as misinformation. So that really worries me greatly. And what kind of depresses me is the bulk of people in society just go along with this. Oh yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, pass that, whatever. And they don't realise it's kind of the boiling frog thing, right? I mean, you wake up 10 years and the government has all these laws, and there's never been any protests about the passage of the laws, but it has the laws. And what worries me next year, the next pandemic that comes around, could be 10, 15, 20 years. It'd certainly be our lifetime. The powers of government will be even greater, and the response will be even more insane, in my view. Yeah,
they talk about the Turnkey Society, where all of those powers you talk about, the boiling of the frog. It's quite right. It's the similar sort of concept where you wake up one day and you didn't know that there were powers in the Biosecurity Act to stop you from travelling overseas unless you'd had 2 COVID injections. You didn't know that just happened under the cover of darkness. And I think we're seeing that more and more with governments now, where these laws are just kind of passed in a way that there's no real consultation, there's no real, going to through the sort of the deep and meaningful dive. We see a little bit of that at the moment with the Albanese government proposing these nature positive laws, amendments to the Environment Act, which no one's talking about, but they're actually quite significant changes to the Environment Biodiversity Protection Act. So this happens all the time. And then, as you say, you wake up in the morning and, hang on, I didn't know the government had the power to monitor my posts. Well, in actual fact, that Home Affairs incident was inspired by the Twitter files. That was actually an FOI that came out of this very office that we found that the Department of Home Affairs was engaging with companies, we suspect probably using AI to monitor the posts of Australians and then dob them into social media companies. So that to me is one of the biggest scandals of our last period, and yet it barely rated on the Richter scale. Incredible stuff. Yes. But once again, I think it's this issue about who's going with the flow of politics and journalism and who's breaking through. You wrote a really good article last August about don't dare question the narrative in the age of inverted morality, which I thought was great. Another one that just hit the nail on the head. And you start off by saying being lied to friends or family members is an unpleasant, potentially devastating experience, eroding trust, sowing doubt about the liar's intentions. And you sort of make the point, I think, quite well in there that this just sort of appeals throughout. There's just this sort of almost static approach to politics and life generally, that you just follow the narrative or you get beaten up on the outside world. I think you've experienced a bit of that, but just I was really interested in that thesis. Is this always been the case, do you think, or is it just a particularly new thing when there's so much pressure on people to conform?
Look, I think it was particularly bad during COVID because it was akin to a war situation, I think, and actually, it got me thinking about, what if there was a war in the future between Australia and some other country, China, say, or something like that? How would the government respond? And I think we saw in COVID how it would respond, right? it responded in an extreme way, like massive, huge. I mean, of course, in a war it would be even worse, which is somewhat scary, right? I mean, you can imagine now in a war, the government would take control of everything, right? It would take control of all communication. I mean, it would be kind of unhinged, right?
Yeah.
Because remember, this was a small virus. This was not a lethal virus, and the government went insane, right? Just over something pretty minor. So I think as a democracy, we've got to the point where we trust and love government so much, and I think this is a bad thing, but I'm just describing reality, that we're okay with that. So it really worries me, what would happen, say, with a virus slightly more lethal. I mean, am I being silly? I don't know, but let's say the virus was more dangerous. Would the government let the police shoot people on the street? That sounds crazy, but now I've seen what happened over something so minor. Then I think, yeah, probably they would, because that's how crazy people are. So I don't know how we got to this point, but if you go back to the pandemics of the 50s and the 60s, the Hong Kong flu and so forth, they were about the same level of lethality as COVID. Of course, there were far, far few old people on the planet back then to die. So, you didn't have the same number of deaths, but they were broadly the same lethality. And, I think someone went to Eisenhower and said, "Oh, sir, we have this new virus." He's like, "Yeah, okay, whatever, just carry on," kind of thing. So, the attitudes have just changed so much.
And we're also living in a global world now as well, where things can be coordinated more easily between countries. So, I think we saw the top-down directives coming from the World Health Organization, which I've got no time for at all, I must say, because I think they were wrong on almost every platform. But that message is now much more easily disseminated amongst thinking like countries who might want to listen, and through our health bureaucracies, and it just filters through. And anyone that deviated from that script, and as you say, quite rightly, we had a pandemic plan. We just went off with the World Health Organization's model in the way it panned out. But you make the point in that article that a lot of the US media in particular are out pummeling each side on politics, but it's not necessarily for the ideas, it's for what you describe as wrongthink, which is so true. I'm the guy that gets called a conspiracy theorist daily, probably on Twitter, and yet everything that we've talked about has been right, once again highlighting some of the problems of misinformation and disinformation. But that can't have happened by accident. Now, this sort of mindset of, is this, as you describe it, the creep of, kind of CCP style authoritarianism, and, all hail to the leader, which is the right narrative? Is that part of it?
Yeah, look, I think that's right. Certainly the Sorry, just ask me the question again. Sorry.
I was thinking this concept of I don't know in politics and public life where there's ever been a time where people are more persecuted for having a different view, is what I'm trying to say. So if you have a different view about COVID, immediately you're jumped on and you're getting death threats and all sorts, or you're getting politically attacked or whatever it is. That seems to me to be a fairly new thing. I've watched politics long enough to know that there have always been dissenting voices, but it seems to me in public life now, it's just a pile on anyone that doesn't conform, which strikes me as being, as you describe it, kind of a symptomatic response to a sort of a CCP style, authoritarian style, don't step out of line or you're dead type approach. And you talk about adopting those lines. That's what it seems like to me. I'm just getting your thoughts.
Yeah. Look, I think the term conspiracy theorist as a pejorative, I think, is losing some force, right?
Yeah.
They're going to have to come up with something else because as you just alluded to before, so many things through the pandemic, but not just the pandemic. Whether it's Hunter Biden's laptop or Vladimir Putin blowing up his own pipeline, those sorts of things. The skeptics on those points were called conspiracy theorists, and then they were proved right, pretty quickly. And throughout COVID, basically everything the skeptics said from the start was proved right. The government was always wrong. So I think for a big chunk of the population, being called a conspiracy theorist doesn't really hurt kind of anymore. So I think they're going to have to come up with a new term. But there definitely is a extremely conformist streak now in the mainstream media about kind of all issues, and if you don't conform, you're called. Well, actually, here's the new term. The new term is far right.
Yeah, that's true.
because as someone who reads a lot of mainstream media, you never see far left; you always see far right. Right? That's. I mean, it's probably 10-1. I would say in terms of mention, which of course makes no sense if they're kind of equal ends of a spectrum. You'd think it'd be 50-50.
Yeah.
But far right is used all the time to describe anyone who the media doesn't like.
Yeah.
It's really got nothing
to do with it. I mean, that's another one I get labelled with all the time as well. And I mean, I would imagine my politics are like somewhere, where without putting words in, probably Liberal leaders of the late 90s, early 2000s probably were then. And it just, I chuckle that I get called far right all the time because I actually think I'm pretty left wing on an intellectual basis. I mean, I'm very anti-war, which is a classic left-wing view. Yep.
I favour a land tax, which is kind of, left-wing, basically tax nirvana.
What a pinko.
So, I mean, they're two really major things. And yet I'm called far right. It kind of makes very strange. And they're very establishment, and they agree with everyone in power. They agree with all the university professors. And yet they think they're left wing. I mean, that's so insane. I mean, actually, that's the classic hallmark of the old right, right? Which was the establishment, right? So you basically agree with everyone in power. I mean, so these people who think they're left wing, they have to realise, isn't it a bit strange that I agree with everyone in power, but I say I'm left wing? But it's actually the people who are called far right who are the revolutionaries now, right? So it's a total inversion.
I think you wrote about that as well. This what is left and what is right now. No, and it's fascinating topic. I mean, it's just a huge. You're absolutely right. I mean, if you went back, probably 5 years, but 10 years, the Green Left was associated with so-called anti-vax sentiment, and now the Greens are cheering on big pharma companies, with no exceptions. And we have seen that. We have seen this so-called left become the establishment. And I keep saying this to people, everyday Aussies that are worried about their country. It's not enough just to assume that your views are going to be heard anymore. You've got to be involved. You have to be. Otherwise, the institutions are not going to protect you, because the Long March has went through the schools, went through the universities, went through politics, and now it's in the corporate sector. And, so it's a really interesting point. Commentators in the US like Joe Rogan, who I think if you went back to the 90s probably would have called himself a Democrat voting kind of libertarian, maybe. It's fascinating.
Yeah, look, it's very interesting, and we can be thankful for COVID in one sense, that I think it's woken up a lot of ordinary, so-called ordinary people to the power of politics and how wrong governments can get things and how they do have to take more notice. So I think that's been a really good thing. I don't know what share of the voting public it would be, but it'd have to be a good fifth or a quarter, and that's a lot.
It's a lot.
That's a lot.
You say in that same article about not challenging the narrative, I just love this paragraph. Highly educated individuals who challenge orthodoxies, risking their social standing in the process, should be listened to more than the lemmings who parrot the orthodoxy without any understanding of the underlying issues. I've never heard it more summarised perfectly than that. That is just, there's no question in that. I just wanted to raise that as a piece of art, because that is exactly why I read it, and I thought that's precisely right.
Oh, thank you.
Don't have a question on that. But what I do have... Sorry, go on.
Oh, sorry. Oh, no, I just wanted to say, just with that point that I made, I do think it's an important point, because I think through COVID, and you're trying to get back to COVID, but, too many journalists, I think they would see, 3 different experts on TV, and, 3 of them, so 2 of them would just spout the government line, and the third one, at great personal cost to him or herself, would have a different view. And the journalist, not thinking, just basically says that all those 3 opinions are equal, and so therefore I'll go with the majority, when actually they don't realise the incentive structure behind what's going on there, right? The 2 people siding with the government, you don't actually know what they really think for a start, right? Because it's in their career interest to side with the government, right? Whether it's getting grants or whether it's being socially accepted or whatever it is. So what I'm trying to say is, the people who side with the majority, their opinion doesn't really count very much, in my view.
No.
But the person who's speaking up at great cost, they are much more worth listening to on any subject.
Yeah. No, I absolutely could not agree with that more. And, once again, congratulations to you for being that guy, the guy out in the wilderness talking against the narrative. Another thing, US politics, it's going to be a massive year. and it now appears to be, well, it's a 2-horse race, 3-horse race if you count RFK. He's been a fascinating influence in the whole thing. I'm interested in your views on, where that's all headed, because you've got a unique insight living in Washington and seeing it all firsthand, with your own eyes, and an incredible time to be in Washington too, by the way. It's going to be a great ride. First of all, what are your impressions of the race? Likely a battle at this stage between former President Donald Trump, current President Joe Biden, and outsider Democrat, establishment family, but now turned, radical, because he's got a different view. Another person veering outside the lanes, RFK Jr. What's the snapshot? What does it look like?
Well, look, I mean, at this stage, it's going to be a rematch between Trump and Biden, which is kind of extraordinary, really, and it's mainly extraordinary, I think, because when Trump announced his campaign back in November 22, he was, very, very low in the polls. Everyone was mocking him. The Republicans had just had a bad midterm election. They hadn't done as well as they'd hoped. Everyone was blaming it on Trump. Hardly anyone turned up to his launch. In fact, I don't think his wife was even there. But anyway, the point is that over the next, 12, 13, 14 months, I mean, he proved everyone wrong, right? I mean, he's a master politician. Whatever you think of him, all the indictments came out, the 4 criminal indictments for various things, and his standing with the public just went up and up and up and up. To the point where he's effectively the Republican nominee now, and barring a health event or we used to say legal event, but increasingly all those cases are going to be pushed past the election. So there's not going to be a legal event, really. I mean, the hush money trial will go ahead in the next month or two, but I think that's very unlikely to put him behind bars. And he's going to appeal it, obviously. This is an insane case anyway. It's so stupid. But the other 3, the serious ones, are just not going to happen before November. So there's going to be no legal event. So the point being is he's going to be the candidate. Now on the Biden side, I mean, I said last year that surely he would not stand again. Something would happen. He'd decide he was going to step aside, or someone would, kind of tap him on the shoulder. Someone in his family would tap him on the shoulder, but that hasn't happened. And he seems pretty determined. So, he's going to run, and it's going to be close. I think it's going to be close. I mean, the betting markets say that Trump is more likely to win, but only slightly. But it's been pretty consistent for some months now. I guess it'll depend a bit on kind of what the economy does, whether inflation, subsides more, whether wages pick up more, because, Americans are very angry about the economy, and quite justifiably, right? I mean, I saw a lot of stories today about, house prices in the US are up like 25, 30% in the last 4 years, which is insane, right? If you're trying to buy a house and you're young, if you're a young independent voter, you'd be very, very angry about the state of the economy. And, wages obviously have not increased by as much. So, look, I mean, if I had to, it's still too far away. We've still got 8 months, so I don't like saying who I think is going to win.
No.
But right now, you'd have to say Trump is. If you're just looking at the polls and the betting markets, you'd have to say Trump's going to win. And
everyone who's familiar with US politics is probably familiar with the concept of the October surprise. I think last time it was Trump catching COVID, if you remember. He with 3 weeks to go or 4 weeks to go, he was in hospital getting Regeneron and then posing on the steps of the White House and the whole show. Whether it made any difference.
Yeah, see, that's how lethal it was. Like a really fat old man was fine. That's how devastating.
Right. That's
he wasn't vaccinated. This is pre-vaccine.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It was too. So it was 2020. Exactly right. So, okay, I'm going to put you on the spot. What's your tip? You're going to call you because you've been so right about so much stuff. What's your tip for the October surprise this time?
Oh God, well, I haven't really thought about that. I guess if I was being slightly facetious, I'd say Joe Biden will die. That's because. I looked at the mortality tables, for an article last year, and actually there's a 12% chance that a man of his age will die in the next 12 months. So 12% is not small, no. And and he's not particularly, he's not a particularly healthy 81-year-old, I would say, just looking at him. So I think that could be a surprise, but the more serious surprise might be that, and this is not October, this is August, around the convention, the Democrat convention, is that he shocks the world and says, actually I'm not going to run.
Yeah.
And so then at the convention, they can pick someone else.
Yeah.
And I think if they did that, I think Trump would be stuffed,
Yeah.
actually, because if they were smart and if they pick someone good and young and likable and centrist, and that's a big ask for the Democrats. But if they did, I think Trump would be stuffed, be over.
It's going to be absolutely incredible, and there's a lot of stuff to watch. There's so much we could go on and on with. I'm conscious of your time, so
Thanks, Alex.
and also it's probably cold there, so I don't know. It'd be 8 o'clock at night or something like that.
Yep, it's about 8. I'm having my scotch here, which is very nice. I finished for the day.
Well, it's about 9:30 in the morning here, so I am not. But if I was, that'd be a problem. So. It's fascinating as always. I want to just now, people, how do they get in touch with you? How do they get in contact with you in terms of social media? You've got a handle, and obviously you write for the Australian, so people should read your articles as a priority, in my view. But just tell people, where they can
thanks very much. So certainly my Twitter site and my DMs are always open, so you can message me there, and so it's just my name, Adam_Creighton, on Twitter or X. So contact me there if you have any ideas.
Yeah, I really do encourage people to read what you write, because it's a beacon of hope out there. So, and thanks for what you did during COVID. Thanks for being a voice of reason in an otherwise, unreasonable environment. And we'll look forward to reading all your stuff in the future. Thanks for coming on Based, and we will speak to you soon.
Okay, Alex, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.